Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to do a brief video on how to calculate mental percentages. We think this is a skill that you absolutely need to have to do everyday life, but we think it's also a skill you might have learned in the past, so we're not going to belabor it. What we do need to remember is in order to calculate a mental percent, we have to understand how to calculate 10% of something. Now, of course, to calculate 10% of something, it is like dividing by 10. Or, like we learned with scientific notation, simply moving the decimal one place to the left. So if I'm looking for the 10% of 95, I remember the decimals back at the end of it, and I'm going to move the decimal one spot to the left. That gives me 9.5. And it's supposed to be that fast and easy. In fact, you're not even supposed to have to think about, well, golly, the decimal's at the end. You should be able to look at 95 and say, 10% is 9.5. You keep all the digits and just change where the decimal is. So I'm looking here at calculating 10% of 170. In your mind, what is 10% of 170? You should have been able in your mind to say 10% of 170, I'm going to keep the digits, move the decimal. I got 17.0. You don't need to write the 0.0. I'm just doing it to show that the digits are there. What about 10% of 32? What is 10% of 32? You should have already been able to calculate that 10% of 32 is simply 3.2. Keep the digits, move the decimal, and it's supposed to be that fast and easy. But that lets us do some other things very quickly as well, like calculating 20%. Because I know that if I took 10% and multiplied it by 2, I would get 20%. So all I need to do is figure out what 20% of 90, or to figure out what 10% of 90 is. 10% of 90, of course, is just 9. If I multiply that by 2, I get 20%, which is 18. 20% of 90 is 18. Find 10% and multiply by 2. So mentally, quickly, try to figure out what these answers are. 20% of 170 and 20% of 32. Start by finding 10%. 10% of 170 is 17. Multiply it by 2, and you get 20%. What about 20% of 32? 10% of 32 is 3.2. Multiply that by 2, you get 6.4. So we found out 34 was 20% of 170, and 6.4 is 20% of 32. Okay. What about if we want 30% or 40% or 50%? It's the same basic principle. Start by finding 10% and multiply by whatever amount you need. So in this case, 10% times 3 is what's going to give me 30%. So if I'm looking for 30% of 62, I can find 10%, 6.2, and in my mind, multiply it by 3. That would be 6 and an 18. I got 18.6, and that takes virtually no time, and you can do that completely in your mind. That's the end of part 1. We hope that these skills prove useful for you in your life.